First, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Joe Dresden, Program Associate with the Kennan Institute. Will Pomeranz, our Deputy Director, is off to Russia today, and Blair Rubel, our Director, has been called away to outside meeting unexpectedly. So I get to chair the last session, which is great.
Anchor.
That's right, I'm the anchor. I have a couple of administrative notes. I'm going to ask everybody to please power off their cell phones as they often interfere with the sound transmission here in this room and the room upstairs. And then I will also just announce, as we don't have any events upcoming this month, but we do have one event scheduled, and that is the first event for the next program year, which will be on Monday, September 24th. The speaker will be Mark Katz, who's a professor at George Mason University. He will be speaking on Russian-Iranian relations, implications for U.S. policy. And Mark is always somebody worth listening to on the subject of Russia and Iran. Today, we are pleased to have Catherine Graber. Catherine is an anthropologist who is currently a Title VIII supported research scholar here at the Kennan Institute. Her previous academic fellowships include from the Social Science Research Council, the University of Michigan, and the National Science Foundation, among others. She has authored several peer-reviewed articles and has lectured at Indiana University, DePaul University, and Buryat State University, I notice, in Buryat.
A little.
A little bit, okay. And she received her undergraduate degree in anthropology and linguistics from the University of Chicago, and her graduate degree is from the University of Michigan. This fall, she'll be going to the Department of Central Asia Studies and Anthropology at Indiana University as a postdoctoral fellow. And with that, I'm going to turn the stage over to Catherine.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Joe and actually the whole Kennan Institute for supporting my research here over the past few months. Is this okay? It sounds kind of echoey to me. It's okay? Okay. I'd also like to thank my research assistant, Ross Irons, who is not here. Hopefully that means he's working. He has patiently coded and logged more hours of Buryat television than he probably ever cared to see or thought he would. He also provided very useful comparisons, very useful comparative perspective from Tatarstan and interethnic relations. So last year was a special anniversary for the Republic of Buryatia, an ethnic republic of southeastern Siberia. 351 years ago, in 1661, a Russian fort that would become the Russian city of Irkutsk was established on a nearby river to control the local Buryat population, secure lucrative Russian trading interests, and to forcibly extract yasak, or fur tribute, from those unruly Buryats. In 2011, this event of what sounds like straightforward conquest was remembered in a series of signs and advertisements around the Buryat capital of Ulan-Ude, like this one on the side of a hotel in the city center. And at the top, you'll see it celebrates 350 years of the voluntary entrance of Buryatia into Russia. And it does so with the popular image, repeated here on another hotel, of two boys, a stylized Russian and a stylized Buryat, with the colors of their respective national flags, happily skipping together into a common future, saying 350 years together through time. The image of the stylized boys carried forward the Soviet-era Druzhba Narodov, or friendship of the peoples, and combined it with public health campaigns and other things in ways that did not always make sense. And it wasn't only visiting scholars like me who sensed the cynical political uses of emblazoning rainbows and smiles over the voluntary entrance of Buryatia into Russia. As more than one resident of Buryatia pointed out to me with a shake of the head, Buryatia did not even exist in 1661, but it was the word voluntary that drew real consternation and no small amount of satire. By the time I arrived in town in August, the celebration had been going on for several months, and it had already become a joke around Ulan-Ude, at least in certain circles of well-educated residents, to celebrate the voluntary birthday of your friend Vadim, or describe cooking a fish as the voluntary entrance of the fish into the boiling pot. The city of Ulan-Ude gained a significant amount of federal money and favors from the celebratory campaign, but the politically expedient liberties taken with history were not lost on its residents. Buryatia is not a separatist state, and the immediate chance of political mobilization along ethnic lines there is low. Yet the anxiousness with which government offices papered the city with imagery overemphasizing positive interethnic relations hints at the ambiguous and sometimes strained relationship that outlying border regions like the Republic of Buryatia and Buryat territories have with Moscow. In my research, I examine ethnic politics by considering in part the political slogans that get slapped up on public walls, but also how humans come to feel and self-identify as something like Buryat on a daily basis, which generally has less to do with dancing on a swirl of toothpaste than with making Buryat food, performing toasts and songs in Buryat, or making and consuming Buryat media. I focus on media in Buryatia partly because of what it reveals as a case study for local indigenous and minority language media in other parts of the world, where there are always interesting center-periphery dynamics, but where the relationships between media and ethno-national politics are rarely as heavily and explicitly ideologized as in Russia. Russia's mass media system is famous in the world for being among the most centralized. Yet the Russian, and before it Soviet state, has supported media development in local languages and for local non-Russian populations that far exceeds similar support in other multi-ethnic states, including the United States, for example. In my dissertation, which I've been developing into a book manuscript while here at the Kennan Institute, I look broadly at what these local media are supposed to achieve and how they actually function. From a policy perspective, I'd like to highlight the value of looking in depth at one place for being able to really see what is happening on the ground in an unusual part of Russia, as opposed to having to rely on educated guesses or on disjointed journalistic reports and snippets. I thought a great deal before this talk, when Joe told me I needed to do it, about what to present as a cultural anthropologist, and wondered whether I shouldn't broaden my material because we don't have a lot of noon discussions here at the Wilson Center from this disciplinary perspective. But this, I think, is one of the two crucial contributions that anthropology brings to policy conversations: sustained, careful attention to local phenomena. And so I'll be very specific and very particular and not apologize again. The second contribution is recognition of the value of looking at diversity of experience. I'll refrain from talking about what Buryats think in the same way I'll refrain from talking about what Russians think, either Ruskiye ethnic Russians or Rossiyskiye Russian citizens. Most of the time, for practical reasons, we want to be able to identify a dominant school of thought or a dominant reaction to unfolding political events. But it's worth keeping in mind that there are always multiple threads of thinking developing simultaneously in different, though possibly overlapping, networks. It's especially important to pay attention to those multiple threads during a time of transition, like what the Russian Federation is going through now, when it's not yet clear which leaders will rise to the top or which ideas will become the through line of history. So first, I'll describe very briefly my research in Buryatia and the Buryat territories, and then I'll use this region to lay out the structure of Russian media markets, or what we might call the media landscape, and where local media fit into it. By looking at the interplay of local media and ethnic politics in Buryatia and the Buryat territories, I'll respond to a question that has recently been raised both inside and outside of Russia. Are local media, produced for Russia's ethnic minorities and often in local languages, stoking ethnic conflict and hastening destabilization of the Federation? I'll argue that although the suggestion makes intuitive sense, in the Buryat case there is little reason to see such media as incendiary, and in fact there are several reasons to see them as effective tools of appeasement and assimilation. So in my dissertation, I drew on 19 months of field research that I conducted over multiple periods from 2005 to 2011 in the Buryat territories of Russia. And there are also Buryat communities over the border in Mongolia and China, but that's outside our scope today. I could talk about it in the Q&A if you'd like. The relevant territories in Russia include the semi-autonomous Republic of Buryatia and two smaller territories, Aga and Ust-Orda, which have been recently dissolved into the surrounding Russian-dominated regions. The carefree Russian and Buryat boys linking arms echoed campaigns from a few years ago, from a few years earlier, that is 2004 to 2007, that had sought to gain support for the for the dissolution of these two regions, which were autonomous okrugs. As most people in the room will be very familiar with, the contemporary Russian state inherited a hybrid administrative structure of territories based on maximizing resource use and territories based on the principle of ethno-national self-determination. During Putin's second term as president, his administration embarked on a plan for administrative recentralization that included merging, as they put it, not dissolving, merging several semi-autonomous ethnic territories with the surrounding Russian-dominated regions, which included dissolving Ust-Orda into the Irkutsk Oblast and merging Aga with Chita Oblast to create the new Zabaikalsky Krai. The mergers proceeded through a series of referendums during which similar imagery drawing on the friendship of the peoples and a brotherly connection between ethnic Buryats and ethnic Russians was paired with slogans such as "always together" and "together we're stronger." The referendums passed in the midst of what many people took for granted was extreme fraud, but there were only minor protests and the mergers proceeded on schedule. The events had the effect, however, of bringing to the fore the issue of cultural preservation and revitalization, which was cast strongly at the time in terms of language preservation and revitalization, or the lack thereof. In the last census in 2010, about 220,000 people within the Russian Federation reported their native language as Buryat, mostly in the Republic of Buryatia and the neighboring Buryat territories. This number makes it one of the major indigenous languages of North Asia, despite over 400 years of Russian-Buryat contact, in which Russian has decidedly been the code of general political and economic power. The only indigenous language with more speakers currently in Siberia is Sakha-Yakut in the northeast. There has been slow language shift from Buryat to Russian, punctuated by fast periods of shift, like what accompanied rapid urbanization and industrialization in the 1960s. This period in particular produced what is felt now as a generation gap between knowledgeable Buryat elders and their Russian dominant children. In discussions leading up to the dissolution of Ust-Orda, some proponents of dissolution claimed that the fact that most Buryats no longer spoke Buryat there proved that political autonomy hadn't actually worked to maintain an identifiable Buryat culture. Similar arguments have been circulated to justify dissolving the Republic of Buryatia. Although they remain mainly rumors and idle speculation, the threat of using language preservation and cultural preservation as a criterion, or as criteria, for ethnic political autonomy has inspired anxiety about the future of the Republic's semi-autonomous status and the future of multiculturalism in Ulan-Ude, a city that prizes it. Ulan-Ude is perhaps best known for hosting the world's largest head of Lenin. But it's also a multi-ethnic, multilingual post-Soviet city that bears the traces of Buryatia's long integration into the Russian Empire and Soviet Union. Among the many languages spoken in Ulan-Ude, Ukrainian, Armenian, and Azeri are particularly important among long-standing internal immigrant populations from the West, and Chinese speakers have been becoming more visible with increasing immigration into the Buryat territories from the south. And Evenki, a native Tungusic language, also deserves special note as the Republic of Buryatia's second major indigenous language. But Buryat and Russian are the official languages of the Republic of Buryatia, and they're my two main field languages, so that's what I'm focusing on here. So methodologically, I conducted a three-part study. My research has included a lot of time in people's homes. I did a household media survey of about 60 households in both urban and rural areas, where I observed media practices and recorded what was in people's homes, interviewed people and often watched TV or listened to the radio or played video games, and otherwise participated in daily media practices and did things that don't sound like work. I also wanted to get a handle on the linguistic practices and ideologies of the journalists and activists who produce this minority language media. Most ethnographic studies of news media to date have been either production studies or consumption or reception studies. But we can only really understand the multi-directional influences of institutionalized media and more ephemeral daily practices by examining both production and consumption. So that's what I've been trying to achieve in my research, is fixing this problem of saying, like, the media made me do it, or the media make me talk a certain way, or the media make that person talk a certain way, and trying to sort of pin down what those actual interrelations are. I surveyed and interviewed journalists and conducted workplace observation at as many different media institutions as I could. So this included both really large stations like the Buryatia State Television and Radio Broadcasting Corporation station in Ulan-Ude, and much smaller places like this one in Aga. And finally, I did a lot of archival research on the development of local media institutions. But what do I mean by a local media institution? Anytime a person opens up an internet browser or turns on the television or the radio or goes to a newspaper kiosk, he or she might encounter a range of media that are produced and circulated within different scales of media markets. And this is the case anywhere in the world, but I'm just outlining Russia's here. So all of the circles should meet, right? You can imagine turning on the television in a village in Buryatia and flipping through the channels to see a dubbed Hollywood film, would be international media, central news programming from Moscow, maybe like Vremya, perhaps region-specific programming designed to cover several large cities at once, like Vesti Sibir, and then a lot of programming that's produced at the regional level and so on. City governments and factories and schools sometimes have their own television stations, but television production is very expensive, so you're more likely to catch district-level media and hyper-local media as newspapers or radio stations or as social networks online that form around particular interests. It is possible to think about internet media in these terms as well. It's just a little more difficult because they're not institutionalized in quite such a clear structure. So in this landscape, locality is always relative. A program on Vesti Sibir, which is a news program for Siberian cities that covers occurrences in Omsk. In Western Siberia is more local to Irkutsk or Ulan-Ude than coverage at the federal level as a whole, but Ulan-Ude's version of Vesti will be more local still. There's a tendency, and I point this out because there's a tendency sometimes to view international and central media, as well as internet media, as part of a pervasive globalizing tide. But there's uneven access to media depending on basic sociological factors like geography and socioeconomic status. This doesn't necessarily mean that villagers in Buryatia will be excluded from the international media market, but that they and we do not have equal access to all global, quote-unquote, global media, as though that were a single and discrete category. So, for example, a cash-strapped pensioner is unlikely to pay the high price tag for home internet access or an international magazine like Cosmopolitan or Shape, very popular in Russia, but she might spend afternoons watching Brazilian soap operas dubbed into Russian on TV. Similarly, the Moscow Times is a central newspaper, but it's not available at kiosks in Ulan-Ude, presumably because there is just not a significant English-speaking audience locally. On the other hand, Buryatia's position along Russia's southern border grants access to some transnational Asian media. World band and satellite radios pick up stations from Mongolia and China, and cable packages in Ulan-Ude include CCTV, the national television network of neighboring China, which broadcasts news and cultural programming from Inner Mongolian in Mongolian. This local variability has a huge impact on ethnic politics because it introduces the possibility of forming alternative regional affiliations, like Mongol affiliations, that are not imposed or directed top-down from Moscow. So in my research, I have focused on these intermediate levels, that is, media produced for distribution at the level of oblasts, krais, and republics like the Republic of Buryatia, and for districts and okrugs like Ust-Orda and Aga. This is where most of the institutional minority language media in the Russian Federation are produced, and when people refer sort of offhand to ethnic media or something in Russia, this is what they're talking about. Many other aspects of how Russia or how media are structured and produced in the Russian Federation are not unlike other large media markets, including the US. Large newspapers, television networks, and blogging sites participate in the international circulation of journalists, such as what happens at the Wilson Center, actually in this room right now, so that people share norms and a sort of international journalistic community. But a couple of things are very different and worth keeping in mind specifically for ethnic politics. One is the system of registration. Institutional media produced in Russia for mass distribution have to be federally registered. So before you can broadcast your own radio or television programming, you have to obtain a broadcast license. That perhaps isn't so different or surprising, but to legally distribute a newspaper or broadsheet, which is very liberally defined, you also will need to obtain a registration number and pay a large fee, and I don't know what the fee is currently. Some people associated with cultural revitalization activism consider this fee and registration system an impediment to developing Buryat-targeted or other local media. I don't know of any cases in Buryatia in which an applicant was refused on political grounds, but it is true that the law could be used in this way. What does not have to be registered, according to a 2010 addendum to media legislation in Russia, are websites. And this is what people are usually referring to when they remark on how amazingly unregulated the Russian internet is. This has had the effect, and continues to have the effect, of pushing a lot of political action that might otherwise happen in print or radio, which are also very cheaply produced and distributed, online. which in a sense makes it easier to keep an eye on. The second important fact is that minority media are predominantly state-funded in Russia. This is important because it means that the production of minority language media does not necessarily depend on there existing a large audience that can understand the minority language and generate subscription sales or advertising revenue. And this goes not just for minority language media, but for local media in general. Media producers worry a great deal about their audience, of course, but production is not contingent on there being a competent audience. This is critical in an area like Buryatia that has experienced extreme language shift, with generations of speakers moving from being monolingual in Buryat to being bilingual in Russian and Buryat, and then becoming monolingual in Russian. People often report their native language, or родной язык, as Buryat because that's their heritage or ancestral language, not necessarily because they have any competence in it. But Buryat language media are legally provided for by the state on the principle that Buryat is the native language, meaning in this case the heritage or ancestral language, of the titular nationality of the republic. So state news organizations and some private media companies provide publications, broadcasts, and limited web services in Buryat. Most of the media produced in Buryat parallels media in Russian, meaning that a radio station, for example, will have a Russian language division and a Buryat language division that may share material and stories and work together on a daily basis in the same studio. Support for minority language media rests primarily on the federal law on the languages of the peoples of the Russian Federation, passed in 1991 and 1998, and a series of supplemental regional language laws passed in ethnic republics like Tatarstan and the Republic of Buryatia in 1992. These laws were part of broader national movements in the early 1990s that have continued through the 2000s, mostly quietly, in the form of cultural and religious revival. The legislation in Tatarstan and the Republic of Buryatia protected, among other things, the right to native language education and required the publication of government documents and signage in both the native language and Russian, though this has been very unevenly enforced. And efforts in the Republic of Tatarstan suffered a setback in 2005 when the federal government forced the Republic to switch back from the Arabic script to Cyrillic. From the perspective of language revitalization, supporting native languages by making them official languages of the Republic and providing media does seem to work, at least to slow language loss. Over the decade that I've been traveling to Buryatia, for example, it has become noticeably more acceptable to speak Buryat in the streets of Ulan-Ude, partly because of extreme post-Soviet migration from rural areas where Buryat is more widely spoken into the city, and partly because the tide of public sentiment regarding Buryat has begun to turn. Most ethnic Buryats in Russia are fully bilingual in Russian or are monolingual speakers of Russian, and Buryat use has contracted so much over the past few generations that some linguists consider the language functionally endangered. The principal language of public life in Buryatia, despite what the official languages are, is still overwhelmingly Russian. Buryat language media could not by itself change that, or by themselves change that. But such media can help to provide examples of text or speech to be used as pedagogical tools, and lessen the embarrassment and rudeness attached to speaking Buryat. And it seems to be working. While using Buryat still smacks of rurality and often the poverty that goes along with it, it also increasingly indexes pride in indigenous Buryat culture, which has become, in a word, cool. So, while Tatar and Buryat revitalization campaigns have enjoyed some limited success, we might look for a counterexample to Karelia. Karelia was unique among the post-Soviet ethnic republics in not making Karelian its official language after 1992. And they have actually, indeed, and then only incorporated some language legislation that would provide for media in 2004 and 2005. And indeed, language loss has been much more extreme there than in places like Tatarstan and Buryatia. But it bears observing that the media that have been developed for a particular local ethnic group are not necessarily in that group's titular language. So in fact, a lot of the content produced for Buryat language media outlets is not in Buryat. Many of the interviews broadcast on television, for example, contain a large amount of code switching from Buryat into Russian, and there are many Russian language programs about events and activities that are demarcated locally as clearly Buryat. That is to say, local Buryat media is not necessarily in Buryat to be considered very Buryat. The flagship Buryat language newspapers of the Republic of Buryatia and Aga even have set percentages of content that will be in Russian, which are slowly increasing. Importantly, the editors do this not because they are directly forced by authorities in Moscow, but because they see their ethnically Buryat audience as increasingly Russian-speaking, and they want to accommodate them, or they feel forced, like they have to, by the situation, to cede some ground to Russian, which you might put in the category of something like self-censorship or reasoning by other means. This helps to answer the provocative question at issue. Does supporting local media in ethnic minority republics hasten destabilization of the Federation? Some media scholars and observers of the development of minority media have argued that by producing and circulating media in local languages or ethnically targeted media content for local populations, the Soviet government encouraged viewers or listeners and readers to continue to imagine themselves, or in some instances imagine themselves for the very first time, as members of discrete ethno-national groups, ultimately making available the conditions for disintegration of the Soviet Union along ethno-national territorial lines. So you look back at ethno-national media during the Soviet period when hindsight is 20/20. According to this argument, local media functioned as one of a number of tools of ethno-national category construction, along with passports and other official documents that require you to list your nationalnost, or maps that delimit ethnic borders. This argument is logically defensible, and reaffirming Buryatness is certainly one of the functions of Buryat media. But simply making available or reinforcing a category does not incite any particular action on the basis of that category. And depending on how you go about practicing media production, producing this media, as, say, the editor of a local newspaper, you might inspire loyalty to ideas other than Buryat nationalism in the process. In order to understand what Buryat media mean for Buryatia's incorporation into Russian society, by here I mean Rossiyski society, we have to look at history. You might have noticed that I chose on the title screen for a talk ostensibly on the 21st century to represent Buryat media with an image that dates to much earlier. Practices of readership were forged in the 20th century, when standardizing a Buryat language and producing Buryat in it were about not only consolidating a Buryat nation within the Soviet Union, but also, crucially, using literacy to create self-empowered Soviet citizens. Books and reading were part and parcel of an industrializing, modernizing state project. And being seen or photographed reading the newspaper became a requirement of being a good Soviet citizen. Arguments that ethnic media leads directly to ethnic nationalism ignore the more subtle ideological requirements of participating in these local media networks and practices. You have to get on board with the project, after all. It's hard to appreciate just how well Soviet media institutionalized equality, seeming to put Russian and Buryat on equal footing in equally formatted newspapers, and rendering the ideological Druzhba Narodov, or friendship of the peoples, in material form. This institutional performance of the friendship of the peoples continues today. If you've ever watched a regional broadcast of Russian language Viesti, you'll recognize the Buryat language version visually, if not orally, as well. It's formatted identically and says Ulan-Ude, city of Ulan-Ude at the top, and Viesti news at the bottom, a news program. It's formatted identically and produced in the same studio. The idea of a brotherhood of people working together within the framework of titular minorities seems to work in Buryatia. My interviewees often cited this fundamental principle as reason to not be overly nationalist, or as a way of declining to say something negative about ethnic Russians or the Russian state. In this way, local, in this case minority language media, actually support positive and pacifistic inter-ethnic relations. Symbolic support for minority language media, even if not very extensive, can serve to appease nationalists. But the subtler, and I would argue more powerful effect, is in materializing the relationship of the minority group to the larger federation of which it is a part. Being part of the Russian state is, for many people of different nationalities living within the Buryat territories, as well as for many ethnic Buryats themselves, constitutive of ethnic identity. Of Buryat identity. This is reaffirmed by local Buryat media that then are both Buryat and Russian in form and content. At issue here is where freedom of self-determination for ethnic minorities can continue to exist in the contemporary Russian Federation. Although the institutional media system appears highly centralized, with a registration system and with tiered central broadcasting stations with these regional affiliates that are highly structured, Siberian journalists are geographically far from Moscow. This means that journalists and editors in Ulan-Ude enjoy some freedom from oversight. Local media institutions are surprisingly free in terms of what opinions may be stated, arguably more so in regions than in Moscow, or at least that's how editors in the Republic of Buryatia perceive them. This creates a space in which people can blow off steam, like opening a pressure release valve. It does not mean necessarily that there's a lot of explicit nationalist or anti-Moscow rhetoric making its way into print or onto the air. The most experienced editors in Buryatia have various strategies for being left alone, many of which come down to what might be described as self-censorship. There is tremendous emphasis placed in Buryatia, even in the face of political protests in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, on living peacefully and calmly, to жить нормально, to live normally. But frankly, even if Buryats were not interested in living peacefully and calmly and нормально, we shouldn't necessarily expect a bunch of incendiary anti-Moscow or anti-Putin rhetoric in local media. Politics in Moscow are simply not the focus of most media personnel's days, because news cycles in Buryatia, as elsewhere, as in Washington, D.C. perhaps, though it's a little odd since it's a center, privilege local content of local and immediate consequence. They're occupied with other matters. National politics are the province of central news media, which is extremely Moscow-centric, and sometimes, or often, provides sound bites to a periphery that often feels, despite all of those efforts at centralization, quite disconnected. In some, local media produced for non-Russians do not only not destabilize the Federation, but may even be helping to maintain inter-ethnic peace, keep minority groups willing members of the Russian state and society, and keep the likelihood of political mobilization in the outlying territories, including the border territories, low. What is potentially destabilizing is Russian nationalism and misplaced xenophobia. Over the past several years, skinheads have actively targeted Buryats in Moscow and Irkutsk in hate crimes, including murder, sometimes because they mistake them for Chinese, and sometimes because of anti-Buryat sentiment. I took this photo immediately outside the border of the Republic of Buryatia in the town of Baikalsk. And you might be familiar with the expression, it's Russia, the state of Russia, for ethnic Russians. Россия для русских. You might have seen this most recently scrawled on banners at the protests in Moscow, where some militant nationalists have periodically been joining the general protests filling the streets. The effect of this kind of behavior is to re-territorialize Buryats within the Republic of Buryatia, because they flee xenophobia and hate crimes by returning to the Republic of Buryatia. And this might remind you of demographic shifts in Central Asia, too, where there's repatriation or homeland return, and populations are actually being re-territorialized. This is not consonant with the vision of state incorporation that has worked for ethnic republics like Buryatia, and I would look to these kinds of practices for thinking about the political future. Thanks.
Catherine, I'm going to lead off today's discussion with a question. That is, you described a process of the ethnic Buryats sort of becoming less competent in their native language. And notwithstanding the fact that now there's sort of a chic to having competency in the native language, there's still that overall process. Mm-hmm. Why didn't that transition take place during the Soviet Union, when they were arguably more interested in sort of centralizing and creating one unified nationality, the Soviet man?
You mean language shift in general?
Language shift in general, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. Language shift did. I might have misspoken or not given enough background in this, but language shift did, in fact, proceed during the Soviet period as well. In fact, it's difficult. We don't have numbers on language shift from 400 years ago, immediately after Russian-Buryat contact. And it's likely that there was some stable bilingualism for a long period of time before people would have been shifting entirely to Russian monolingualism. But language shift from Buryat to Russian, or from stable Buryat-Russian bilingualism to Russian, certainly proceeded over the Soviet period, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, when there was this rapid industrialization and urbanization, and a lot of kinship networks in which Buryat was spoken and passed on to children were disrupted when lots of people flooded into the cities. Simultaneously, there were huge migrations of populations from other parts of the Soviet Union, especially Ukraine and Azerbaijan, Armenia, into the Republic of Buryatia, and that meant that suddenly Russian had to be used as a lingua franca. The reasons for language shift are always very complex, but it generally has something to do with, either or all. Urbanization, breaking down family structures like that, creating economic incentives for speaking the dominant language, not making education available in the local language as a medium of education. And actually all of these factors were at one time or another true in the Soviet Union. So it was almost overdetermined.
Okay. Take some questions from the floor. Can we have someone get a microphone, please? We'll be right with you. We'll go here first. Please raise your hand, and here's the next question. Okay, so first to Thomas.
My name is Thomas Greenberg.
Let's try one more time.
My name is Thomas Greenberg.
Well, I'll repeat the question. Just go ahead and ask it, just so we get the recorded question. They're not working? Okay. Okay. No. Nope. Okay. Well, we're without microphones today.
You could repeat every question.
So, what is your question? Go ahead.
My name is Thomas Greenberg. When I was trying to learn some Russian, they told me there was a difference between Ruskiye and Rossiyskiye. Is this essentially a difference between ethnic and national identities? Are there many Ruskiye in Buryatia, or are they all called Rossiyskiye? I also noticed that Buryatia borders Mongolia. Are there many Buryatis in Mongolia?
Okay. So the question for those who are listening in on our webcast and on the audio tape has to do with Ruski versus Rossiyski, and what is the percentage of Ruski, the ethnic identity within Buryatia, and also as Buryatia borders Mongolia, what is the Buryat population in Mongolia? Can you say anything about that?
Thank you for the question. So, yes, the difference between Ruski and Rossiyski is that Ruski is to denote ethnic Russian, including the Russian language, and Rossiyski refers to citizenship, so membership in the state. So, most Buryats living in Russia and most Russians of Ruskiye living in Russia and within the borders of the Russian Federation are all Rossiyskiye. So that is their pan state identity. And the difference is important and kind of interesting in Buryatia sometimes. Friends of mine will occasionally refer to how they wish that they could identify themselves as Rossiyski more easily and didn't have to specify that they were Ruski or Buryatsky or Tatar or whatever they are by local nationality, and that they often will remark that it's nice that the term American means that, right? American is essentially the same, not perfect, but it's the same principle as Rossiyski. So among the many Rossiyskiye in the Republic of Buryatia, Buryats number about 30% now. It actually grew from the last census between 2002 and 2010 censuses. The percentage of Buryats in the Republic of Buryatia grew, even though the number changed a bit because the category shifted. And the same thing went for Ruskiye. So the percentage of Ruskiye in the Republic of Buryatia went down. I should have looked this up right before the talk, but I didn't. I think it's something like 45% or something like that. I apologize if that's radically off. But it changed a bit over the last 10 years, partly because it became very popular in the 2010 census for ethnic Russians who lived in Siberia to identify instead as a new ethnicity, Sibiryak, Siberian. So this is also a really fascinating phenomenon to follow in the coming years, a Siberian regional identity that's asserting itself as an ethnic identity and attempting to use state resources like the census to do so. The border with Mongolia is often a political hot topic locally. There have been a series of migrations back and forth across the Russian-Mongolian border over especially the 20th century. The most important example, perhaps, is that a large number of Buryats fled forced collectivization of their herds by escaping over the Mongolian border. And so for that reason and for other reasons, there are actually quite a lot of Buryat communities inside of Mongolia proper, as well as in Inner Mongolia, which is not too far away. In more recent history, those very, very strong national borders between China, Russia, and Mongolia have prevented a lot of Buryats from participating in the kind of exchanges that a lot of them would like. A number of Buryats that I know who are especially serious about their Buryat identity spend as much time as they can in Mongolia and pass back and forth across that border, but it is not, right now is a relatively free time, it is not always an open border.
All right, so a lot more hands went up, but this person was next in line. Is the microphone working yet?
They're working.
There we go.
Hi. First of all, thank you for the wonderful photos. It added so much. My name is Mindy Reiser. I have worked as a journalist. I've also worked in the former Soviet Union, particularly the Caucasus and Central Asia, where there's some interesting phenomena. I'd like to know about sort of higher intellectual life in terms of literature, in terms of theater in Buryat. That's really crucial. Are people wanting to spend the time to write in Buryat when the audience for that is rather limited? And that would have to be translated then into Russian. And if it's really successful, then into other languages. And my other question is about China. You mentioned presence of Chinese, and of course there were real tensions in terms of the future relations between China and Russia. And how are the Chinese seen, and what are they doing there, and how are they received?
Yeah, these are both great questions. Thank you. So very briefly, yes, there's a very well-developed literature in Buryat and a very well-developed Buryat literature in Russian. Those were fostered especially during the 1960s in the Soviet Union as part of, actually not just there, but probably in other parts of the former Soviet Union as well, as part of a general sort of Soviet elite building, you could say. And literature locally is still very popular. Even more popular is theater. So the Buryat theater is very, very well developed, and it's one of the most fabulous things you can do in Buryatia is go to the theater. I have to say, I think the Russian language theater, while good, is not nearly as good as the Buryat language theater. Part of what happens there is that people who remain very committed to fostering a Buryat language environment for their children, for example, or for each other, will stay in the Republic, and so you get an amazing talent pool. Russian language actors are much more likely, and opera singers and other cultural producers, right, are much more likely to go to Moscow and St. Petersburg if they can, or to Novosibirsk or to Irkutsk or another larger city. And this is probably true in other ethnic republics as well, that you get a sort of outflow of talent in Russian, but cultural production in the local languages remains just incredibly high because it's the people who really want to stay who do.
Has this stuff been translated?
Oh yeah, there's into English, you mean, or into Russian? Your question actually before reminded me that it is funny how rarely material is translated from Buryat into Russian. But yeah, there are not very many efforts thus far to translate Buryat poems or plays into English. Unfortunately, there aren't enough of us who study both Buryat and are English speakers. Regarding China, but I would encourage you to go to the Boreat Theater. Regarding China, the relationship to China in Russia in general, I think, is very ambivalent, and in Buryatia in particular. On the one hand, ethnic Buryats are tired of being mistaken for ethnic Chinese, and both Buryats and Russians locally often band together against the sort of what they see as the yellow tide and yellow peril from the south. Chinese have functioned for the last 15 years or so in Buryatia very much the way that Mexican laborers in the United States function, and a lot of the rhetoric is very similar. They're treated as day laborers, and Chinese is very rarely spoken on the streets of Ulan-Ude, even though there is a significant portion of the population that is native speakers. I've even had situations, in fact, while walking down the street in Ulan-Ude, I hear two people walking behind me, and they're speaking Mandarin, and I turn my head and they stop. I take it the xenophobia is even harsher than I recognize it myself there. On the other hand, a lot of younger people are now studying Chinese in school. Some of the local elementary schools have started offering it, not just as a subject, but as a medium of instruction. And the local university, Buryat State University, has one of these Confucius Institutes, which you might be familiar with at your home universities, that provide a lot of money directly from the Chinese government for specifically Chinese cultural and linguistic programming. So, and there's a lot of recognition of the business opportunities that are afforded by Chinese. So Chinese and English are by far the most important, or considered the most important second or third or fourth languages for you to learn as a young person if you want to pursue business. But I should also mention that as another negative on the side, this is sort of like a checks and balances, right? Like the pros and the cons. In the con column, but also in the pro column, is the tremendous reliance of the Chinese government on Siberia's forests. So a huge number of logs pass over the border on a daily basis. On the one hand, this provides a lot of business opportunities for people who want to be involved with simple trade and and border trade. But on the other hand, it feels on a daily basis like your immediate environment is being shipped to a foreign country, and it's very visceral, and people's reactions are very visceral to it as well. And a lot of forest fires and illegal logging is blamed on the Chinese as well. So that would be a great topic for somebody. If there's anybody here who's interested in working in China, I'm trying to give someone this project.
Well, we have about 15 minutes and a number of questions. We'll go here, and then here, and then here.
Thank you very much. Ann Phillips, I'm a public policy scholar here. Just a question about methodology. You mentioned you spent a lot of time in the about 60 families. Mm-hmm. How did you pick the families? Was everybody happy to have you come, or did you start with 300 families and come down? How did that work? Just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's always happy to answer a methodology question. I had to rely on snowball sampling a lot, which is not necessarily the best methodologically, but it's what happens when you need willing participants, especially to invite you into their homes. I occasionally would approach people who weren't interested in having a foreigner in their homes, but this happened more with journalists actually, who were worried about talking with anyone about their sort of politically sensitive positions occasionally. Most people did not refuse home visits or discussions about the media that they use at home because those are easy topics in a way, you know. But I relied mostly on snowball sampling. I was quite surprised at the end of my study to find that even though I had relied on snowball sampling, I ended up with a remarkable mix of people in different households in different villages and regions. I would go to any village or region that was anytime I had the opportunity, with good gender distribution, more women than men, but that reflects gender distribution in the Russian Federation and Republic of Buryatia currently anyway. Good age distribution, although a little bit skewed toward older people than younger. This was something that this is a common ethnographic sort of trick is afterward to look back at your data and fill in the gaps and figure out who you haven't talked to, and then try at the last minute, 2 days before you get on a plane, I got to talk to 5 more people in this category. Yeah.
We're going to take the next two questions in a row, and we'll see if we have time left. So first here, and then on this side of the room.
Thank you. My name is Fatima Tlisova. I'm from Voice of America. Originally, I'm from the Caucasus, so there are a lot of parallels between the situation in the Caucasus and in Buryatia. My question is about actually, I'm repeating the question about Mongolia, but maybe in some kind of other way. I have a friends in Buryatia who identify themselves as Buryat Mongol.
Mm-hmm.
And they speak about closer relationships with Mongolia, and they're lobbying this idea of reuniting some parts of Buryatia with Mongolia. How influential is this idea? Is it presented anywhere in the local media, and in which sense, political, cultural, or economical? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Before you answer, we'll take this question here.
My name is Dylan Miles Primakoff. I'm at Georgetown University. My question is about the sorts of media institutions you were describing, like the Buryat language version of Vesti. I wanted to know, first of all, are institutions like that fairly universal among the ethnic republics? And are there similar institutions that exist for other indigenous languages that aren't associated with the titular republic? And on that latter question, if not, are there other sorts of indigenous language media that are common among those indigenous groups not associated with an ethnic republic?
Yeah, those are great questions. Okay, I'll answer these quickly in order. Yeah, your friend in Mongolia, who is lobbying for the Buryat Mongol position, already by using the term Buryat Mongol is setting out a sort of political position that locally is shared by some particularly well-educated elite activists in Buryatia. Also, the sort of cultural elite, including a lot of people who've worked in cultural production, like theater, for many years. It's not reuniting the Buryat Mongol or the Buryat territories between Inner Mongolia, Mongolia, and Russia is not. It's not politically possible in the minds of most of the people who actually support it, but they often support radical positions as a way of trying to move, in my experience at least, as a way of trying to move the discussion in that direction. And a lot of times they are better informed about Buryat history and remember or understand that the borders of the contemporary Republic of Buryatia and the borders of the Buryat territories inside of Mongolia as well have shifted many times over the past couple of centuries and are just as dependent on political reasons as they are on the actual bounds of people who self-identify as Buryat. It doesn't appear very often in media. It does appear in sort of regional oppositional media occasionally. Some of the people involved with those movements have felt quite forced out of Russia, and there's been no small amount of harassment of them, it's possible to say. So this is one of the few topics that really is not approachable in local media in Buryatia, unfortunately. For institutions like Vesti that have local minority language versions, that is very common. That's actually part of how support for minority language media in Russia looks super centralized and institutionalized. Is that you have these, you have Vesti in Moscow, the GTRK, and then they have their own regional affiliates that will have the Buryat language division or the Tatar language division. For languages that are not, but those are for the titular languages of republics. So for the smaller languages, like I mentioned Evenki during my talk briefly, and then sort of said I'm not going to deal with this. Evenki is a classic example of a language that's not an official language, but it is an important indigenous language locally. And what happens with Evenki is what happens in a lot of other republics, including Tatarstan and Karelia, where the sort of second-tier indigenous languages get whatever they can lobby for locally. So it depends less on funding and decisions in Moscow than for the titular languages. Instead, for example, Evenki has Evenki language programming because of lobbying to the Republic of Buryatia directly. And so that's another really fascinating part of the sort of system of ethnic minority language that I didn't have as much time to work on. In Buryatia, there's one program per week, runs 15 or 20 minutes, that's in Evenki, but it says it's Evenki language, but it's not always in Evenki. It's that kind of thing. I think Evenki, like a lot of these sort of second-tier unofficial indigenous languages, has a really hard time. And so, this is it's a great topic if you want to work on it somewhere else. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay. Is there a final question from the floor? Yes, we have one right here.
So you started off by talking about asking this question of, do local language media stoke ethnic tensions? And you don't find evidence of that in Buryatia. And my question is, I'm just curious what topics are being covered in the Buryat language press, print press in particular. Mm-hmm. And you'd mentioned also doing some comparison analysis with local language press in Tatarstan. Mm-hmm. Sort of what topics are covered in Buryatia, and are they different from what's being covered in Tatarstan?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should have mentioned what I meant when I said Buryat content, or content that is considered Buryat locally. The topics that are considered Buryat locally include things like theater, in fact, the arts, performance, dance, similarly in Tatarstan, as far as I understand. That sort of bleeds over sometimes, and you'll have genres of genres of the performing arts that are otherwise considered ethnically Russian that get lumped in anyway, like opera, that sort of become Buryat topics as well as Russian topics if they are being performed by Buryat performers. Other important topics that are on Buryat television and radio and newspapers, and not so much in the general media, Russian language media for the public, are especially religious topics. And I imagine that too is similar in Tatarstan. The region is undergoing a great deal of religious revivalism and revitalization in Buddhism and shamanism especially, and those domains in particular are attached very strongly to Buryat language use. And so even if Buryat is not used in a particular story, those are considered Buryat genres, and they'll be covered in Russian language news as well, but often in the framework of a Buryat program, if that makes sense. They're also extremely popular, and I think those are in fact the single most important. This is part of what my wonderful research assistant Ross is working on. Actually, is this log of television programming that will make it possible to actually quantify what topics are being covered more often in which languages. Unfortunately, I'm speaking kind of as from my general sense instead of with a quantitative background. But yeah, those are the most Buryat.
Okay. Well, I think we will close on that note. Before I dismiss class, I just would like to encourage everyone to follow Kennan Institute on Facebook, if you are on Facebook, to also register for our email news updates from the Kennan Institute website at wilsoncenter.org/Kennan. And with that shameless promotional announcement out of the way, I want to thank you all for coming to this year's events. I want to thank Catherine and all the other speakers who have made it such an exciting year for us. And once again, thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing all of you in the new year on September. Thank you.